Ha! Thank you, Cal. I did have the button on that set. Can you hear me now? Of course, there's a 30-second wait. Ha ha. Yes, Mandy, I think it was my sound that wasn't working. Of course, there's a 30-second wait. Okay, so what I had been saying in that minute that I was muted was just if you got questions, I'm happy to talk science, some of the stats in Saskatchewan, if you want to just talk about what's going on with vaccines, with variants of concern, or really just how do I find certain things within the provincial dashboard or navigate my own. Like really anything I'm willing to just sort of talk about. So I will look to the chat and I'll wait for someone to ask something. If nobody's going to ask a question immediately, I guess I should just talk, huh? Something I was thinking about yesterday. This will just be random stuff for now. Do you know, or are you aware of how to check your mask's fit without any sort of technology? And then, Mandy, I will get into the AstraZeneca efficiency if you want. So I'll do this super quick. So imagine you got a mask, whatever mask you want. I grabbed a couple just for, this is the one I wore double layer yesterday when I was at the grocery store. But you got your mask on, right? Some people you might have seen online in a sort of mocking way, like, why do you have 15 masks on? Or like, is 2 better than 1? Is 3 better than 2? Like at what level do you have too many, right? And I was thinking about like, people might not really know how to gauge that. So imagine you got a mask on. The best way you have, the simplest way to check your seal, whether the air is going through the mask or whether it's going out through the gaps, is to artificially enhance your seal on your mask. And just take breaths, just breathe in and out. So doing this, just taking breaths in and out, I'm getting a feel for how rebreathed is my air, how humid, how warm, right? And what I can do is just take little breaths and feel that difference. And if it feels like when my fingers are sort of making that extra firm gasket, that it's more restrictive for me to breathe, that it's warmer, that it's more humid, that tells me that the seal on my mask isn't that good when I'm just wearing it on its own. And that in mine, I've actually put little additional like nose piece wires so that I can bend it a little more because, you see that gap that some people have and it really reduces the efficiency of your mask, right? And if you've got 2 or 3, like imagine you had a solid plastic mask form fitted to your face, the only way air could get out would be through gaps, right? So you can imagine if you had 15 layers, like you might reach that point where nothing is going through the mask at all. It's all going through what other gaps are actually present. So you can sort of just, check every time you put your mask on, like how's my seal today? And if it's, more restrictive, that's better because it's going through the mask and actually being filtered and not going through the sides. So that was my little chat waiting for someone to ask a question. So the AstraZeneca we had, right? Yes. So if we want to think about how our different vaccine efficiencies could be measured, or if we wanted to think about just doing clinical trials, and if you wanted to figure out does this vaccine work or not? So you apply the vaccine to someone, inject it, whether it's a mRNA, whether it's a attenuated virus, whether it is a sort of modified virus that carries the DNA payload for the spike protein the way that AstraZeneca is. And The second part of looking for vaccine efficiency is you need to wait for people to actually get infected, right? So, yeah. 1, inject. That's an E, believe me. 2, wait to infect. 3, monitor, of course. So while we're waiting for people to become infected, this is something that it's not ethical for us to infect people intentionally with COVID or really with any other sort of disease, because we don't know what the potential outcomes might be, especially when it's a brand new thing, right? If it's a virus that we know has very good safety and we're just trying to do vaccine sort of research, maybe we infect people purposefully. But right now, we're saying, like, we don't want people to be infected in order to see if the vaccine is working or not. What we do, or what we can do, is test the vaccine in places that have a very high prevalence of COVID right now. And clinical trials have been done really around the world, but a lot of them in Europe and in Brazil and in South Africa and just sort of various places. And being able to look at what variants or strains might be present in those locations, and if you waited a month, 2 months, 3 months, how many of the people in the placebo group happened to get COVID illness, symptoms, hospitalizations, runny noses even, loss of smell, death as a potential endpoint, but no sound, someone says. I think my sound is working. But I'm going to. Hospitalizations, runny noses even, loss of smell. Yeah, I think my sound is working. It wasn't working at the start, but maybe your chat is because you're reading from the start. Okay. So we can't infect people on purpose, but if we go places where there is a lot of COVID, they will get infected over time. So what we can do is just monitor 5,000 people who get the vaccine, 5,000 people who don't, or 10,000 or 50,000. And then we look to see how many people after a certain length of time got COVID. And something just changed on my screen there, so I'm just gonna jump to the side. I'm gonna keep talking. What we look to see is how many people didn't get symptoms as the simplest endpoint we could potentially do. If we wanted to check to see if the vaccine actually prevents people from getting infected, we would have to do COVID tests on everybody, probably every week, if not maybe every few days, to look to see how quickly it was until someone became a positive test. We don't want to have to sample all 10,000 people in a clinical trial multiple times a week for potentially months on end. We can't intentionally infect them, so the simplest thing to look for is just if someone becomes symptomatic, then we do a COVID test. If it is COVID, then we say, yes, there's someone who got COVID, or no, they aren't, right? So in the case of AstraZeneca, there were a few things done in sort of strangely with their trial. They had this like half dose versus full dose group, but the sort of important endpoint was that they saw about a 65% reduction in the number of people who became COVID positive after their first and second dose. And also, nobody was hospitalized and nobody died compared to regular COVID cases when people do. So when we think about AstraZeneca, yes, it has, through the clinical trials, a lower efficacy than what was found with the Moderna, for example, the BioNTech, the RNA-based vaccines, where they were finding 90, 92, 95% efficacy. But in all cases, it prevents hospitalizations, severe illness, and death. It may not prevent a low-level sort of, small amount of initial infection and some symptoms that are mild, and then you get over it. And we know that, even the Pfizer or the BioNTech or the Moderna, they are not necessarily preventing you from becoming infected. They're preventing you from becoming symptomatic, right? Which is one of those things where we said we don't really know whether after you've been vaccinated if you should still be wearing a mask. You probably should, because until we have that herd immunity, we want to try and prevent people from, even in a short term, getting infected and passing it on to someone else before it has a chance to sort of have, control across the community, control across the province, whatever it might be. I'm going to read a little bit more. So AstraZeneca, yes, it's 20-25% lower efficacy for symptoms, but still apparently 100% efficacy for preventing death and preventing hospitalization, which is what we need, right? If we can get more vaccines in arms more quickly, that's going to get us to, very easily that COVID-0 type of situation where herd immunity brings our reproductive rate, the chances of one person infecting another person, down to 0.5, 0.25, 0.2, where 5 infected people only make 1. Like, the virus is going to burn itself out in that situation. I'm going to look for the next question. Okay, so efficacy, masks. So just to sort of get back to the masking, so checking your seal, you do want to wear the best mask right now that you have available to you. If you have an N95, if you have, if you can double mask and you've got your paper mask or your disposable and your cloth mask. My daughter made these over the summer, 2-layer cloth masks, pretty cheap, right? And it was good to have these masks when it was not really accessible for everyone to get them. They were sold out. These disposable ones are actually, these sort of medical procedure masks, a higher efficiency of filtration. They're usually made with a couple different layers, and I think it's the woven polypropylene layer that creates a bit of a static charge on it. So because of the mixed materials, it can create like a static differential, which can also help to repel some respiratory droplets, even things that might make it through the filter. You can imagine just by static, like, rubbing a balloon on your hair and things like that. You can feel it on your arm and sort of having that pull up, like that static can help to repel some stuff, right? So my sort of go-to for masks right now is cloth over the disposable. Disposable, sometimes a little harder to get a good seal, whereas this has, nice stretchy straps that I can adjust, and this has got my nice fitted nose piece. And just, right now the best mask that you can wear is the one that's going to keep you the safest. It's going to keep the people in your household the safest. It's going to keep the people that you interact with when you're out and about the safest, right? Regina. Let's talk about Regina for a little bit. Actually, shrink that down a little bit. So when we're thinking about Regina and looking over sort of a period of time, and I might actually switch to a different screen just because I can. Hey, I'm going to pop into this one. Browser. Okay. So what we have here is the dashboard that I built. It's in my Twitter profile if you want to ever take a look at it. I do mess around with things a little bit. But right now, this is Saskatoon right here, and this is Regina. And you can see that Regina's incidence, the number of cases per 100,000 people, averaged over 7 days per day. So can sort of think about it as like a speed measurement, how quickly your new case is accumulating. Our incidence in Regina is 17.72. The incidence in Saskatoon is 8.28, so approximately twice as high. And that's a little bit hidden if we were to look up here at the number of new cases. So 23 versus 52 cases, or if we were to look at another day, sometimes Saskatoon could have the same number of cases as Regina, but because Saskatoon has 334 versus 273, 60,000 more people, about, 20% more people in Saskatoon than Regina. If we don't compensate for that change in the size of the city by making it per 100,000, the numbers in Saskatoon will just always seem larger. Not hugely significant. It's not like comparing active case numbers in Saskatchewan versus Alberta or Ontario or something like that, where you're looking at 4 times or 8 times the population. But definitely a per capita basis does help us make sense of things a little bit more sort of closely. How many active cases are there per 100, per 1,000, per 100,000 individuals? So the incidence in Regina is about twice as high as it is in Saskatoon right now, and the weekly positivity, and I like to also do this by week because daily there's fluctuations in the number of tests that get done in each city. Drive-through gets shut down for a day, or people don't make lots of appointments on Sundays. Just things change week to week or throughout the days of the week. The positivity in Regina is 9.3% right now, and in Saskatoon it's only 4.28. So again, about double. For a period of time, both Saskatoon and Regina had very similar incidences and positivities. So I'm going to go to the 32 subzone incidence here. So I'm going to also zoom that in, set that down. Perfect. Okay, so in brown here is the incidence of Regina over time, and in green is the incidence for Saskatoon over time. And this is just from January 31st. If we wanted, we could put this back a little bit more. Let's go all the way to January 1st here. What you can see is that coming out around the holidays, around Christmas and New Year's, Saskatoon and Regina had very similar incidences. The number of cases per 100,000 per day was fairly similar. Testing as well and positivity were pretty closely tied together. And both cities saw really a drop in testing, which led to an increase in positivity and sort of this artificial suppression of our case numbers. We were detecting fewer cases than were actually being created out in the public. Both of them started to come up as we sort of got to about January 10th here. You can see Saskatoon was 17, Regina was 19, getting up to the 11th here, 21, 21, like just about perfectly matched, right? And that was us starting to discover this backlog of new cases in both of these cities and really around the province. People weren't doing as much testing over the break as they were previously in December. Regina started to come down and Saskatoon went up. And that could have been just Saskatoon already had a higher incidence. There was a higher true rate there, or maybe there were a few super spreader events, right? But, people really mid-January started to take note and realize, like, we have this false sense of security that our numbers had gone down over Christmas. The reality was once we started testing again, they went up, and then people self-regulated. And something that modeling won't capture very well, I'm gonna have a drink of water here. Modeling doesn't really capture that people do self-regulate. I hit a bit of water. If the case numbers are low, people are going to less stringently follow the guidelines. If the case numbers are high, people are going to spread out their grocery trips. They might decide not to go out for dinner, but eat in instead and order, right? People will change their behaviors based on their understanding of what's happening around them. So, maybe Saskatoon took a little bit longer or actually had a bit of a higher level, but we can see that, both of them started to come down through the sort of second half of January here, but then Regina started going up again. Only at the start of February did we discover that there were variants of concern, at least 2 cases, travel-related in Regina. And then later we found another one in Saskatoon, again, travel-related, was supposedly, self-isolated. By the time we found out that that person was a variant of concern or had a variant of concern case, they would have already resolved because it took over 2 weeks for us to actually send the samples off to Winnipeg. But, Regina came up, Saskatoon went down. We had this sort of inversion here, but, we're like, was that a lot of change in Regina? And then it went down again. So, this at this point in time, I wasn't too concerned because the rate of Regina going up didn't raise a lot of red flags. But really, once we got to about here, the 20th, so I think it was last weekend on Sunday, I made this post and I said, what's happening in Regina? And I looked at the positivity, I looked at the number of active cases, and I looked at the incidence, the rate of new cases, and I was like, they're not just going down slower than Saskatoon, but they're starting to go up. And what we can see is we've now reached this point. So there was that one day that we had 50 cases that dropped everybody on Tuesday. But right now, the overall incidence of Saskatoon Regina is about double, about twofold higher. We also found out on Tuesday that there were 2 community transmission cases of B117 in Regina. And now I'm going to go back to the whiteboard so I can draw something out for you. Source capture, transition it. Yeah. So still talking about Regina cases. So how will a variant of concern, if it's being community transmitted, start to sort of take over this growth curve? And what we can imagine, this is time, this is cases. Yeah. So let's imagine a wave of the pandemic, right? Cases build up, people start to take notice, extra precautions get put in, we change regulations, people just, stay home. Whatever happens that causes people to fear that the pandemic is occurring, and then case numbers will drop, right? And we know that the pandemic comes in waves like this. The thing that can't be captured in a situation like this is if we had a different strain, a different variant of concern. And I don't really want to use strain here quite yet, because strain we typically talk about, it has much better immune evasion. If you can get infected with one strain, you could get still infected with a second strain. Here with our variants, there should be, at least right now, from what we believe for B117, existing immunity to wild type, previously circulating COVID is about the same or about as effective for B117. But let's imagine that at some point in time, we've got a very low level of these B117 cases, right? Given the overall situation in this population, so maybe it's a city such as Regina, the same behaviors that people are doing, if we have a virus like B117 that is more transmissible, so we know that the spike protein on the virus actually has a higher binding affinity to the surface receptors of your cells, which means it probably has a better chance of less virus creating an infection, which means it's going to be more transmissible, right? Less period of time, less droplets that are inhaled, a greater distance between 2 people. These could still lead to the probability of an infection taking place. Whereas in normal COVID, it might not create an infection, right? It's just a little better at doing its job of transmitting to someone else. That's what natural selection does for these mutations, is it selects for the virus that is a better virus. And in the case of a virus, it's all about spreading to other individuals, right? So numbers start off really low, but the control of these numbers isn't going to be following the same set of rules. We could have a situation where people are, not visiting people outside of their homes. We have restaurants down to, 50% capacity, and you shouldn't be, with other people. Maybe big box stores are down to 25%, whatever it might be. That might be enough regulation to take the RT, our reproductive rate, sort of how many people will get infected per infection of wild type COVID, might be less than 1. So those numbers will start to decrease per unit of time. And we could have a different strain. So let's say our wild type is that, but let's say our B117 is actually greater than 1. Let's say it's maybe about 1.5. And we know that there's good evidence that B117 is about 50% more transmissible. So an RT of 1 would create an RT of 1.5 approximately in our B117. So under these same conditions, this virus is starting to actually increase in number. And at first, so we've got all these red cases and they're going down, and these green cases and they're starting to accumulate. If we were to graph the combined total, if we weren't variant testing and just looking at overall number of cases, what we would see is the total first tracks nicely with our red line, and then it starts to diverge a little bit here. And you can imagine that this increase here is equal to the red plus the green. And what we'll see is that it'll come down to this point where we're about half and half. And then if our green is continuing to go up, the green plus red at this point will start to sort of plateau, because maybe the green going up is about equal to the red going down. So the total, the combined, sort of plateaus for a little bit. And then eventually we're going to hit the situation where it's only the green, it's only the variant cases, and none of the red cases. So looking at Regina's numbers, looking at the incidence right now, looking at the positivity, looking at the active case counts, you would expect that if a variant was undergoing community transmission, you would start to transition through this, like it's dropping, it plateaus, and then it starts to go up. Even if you're not testing for any variants, that's just a good indicator that something has changed in that population to make a virus that's more transmissible. Right now, we only know of 2 community spread cases in Regina that were discovered on Tuesday, and they were found or first sampled, or those individuals were tested at the end of January, 3.5 weeks earlier. So we don't know the extent of community spread, but it does make sense that if we have 2 cases of community spread, there are likely more. Where did those 2 people get B117 from? From the community, and it's likely spreading through other people in the community, right? So that's probably what is happening in Regina right now, because it's unlikely that it's just a few super spreader events that happened at a business or happened at, some house parties or Super Bowl or something like that. There could have been a super spreader incident to start it, to sort of kick it off from that first case to 10 cases type of thing. But I think the sort of feeling of the data is that Regina is probably getting more variant cases, and the decrease of wild type cases and the increase of variant might have had some period of sort of balancing each other out. And it looks like right now it could be the variant that's going up. The only 2 times that we've had any sort of indication that variant cases are happening, both were released that information on Tuesday. So it's possible, and this is sort of conjecture on my part, that the samples that we sent off to Winnipeg, we might not get daily updates on our samples. Maybe we only send out like a batch of samples in a week, and maybe we get our sort of results back again on sort of a weekly basis, depending how it samples or feeds through all of the other provinces that are also using the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg. But, I'm sort of keen to look to see what happens next Tuesday. Are we going to hear about more variant cases or not? Okay. I'm going to go to my next question. Taha, what application am I using? I'm using OBS to run a couple scenes that I transition through. It's used for like gamers and stuff. I'm using my Surface for the pen to remote into the desktop to capture that as a second screen. It's ridiculously complicated, but I'm a nerd, so I do this for a living, right? Sean, who's a friend of mine back in Edmonton, can you intermix the vaccines? There's really no good reason to think that we can't mix 2 vaccines, whether it's an RNA to another RNA, an RNA to a subunit, or to a sort of simulated virus. So The AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines are going to be almost like gene therapy in that it is a non-dangerous sort of virus that will infect you and carry with it the gene to make spike protein encoded in DNA. Because it's DNA, it'll stay in your cells for longer and turn into RNA and get expressed. And again, make spike protein the same way that our mRNA-based vaccines just contain essentially the read-only copy to sort of express into spike protein as opposed to a more like permanent version or sort of RAM versus ROM sort of thing, or remembering a phone number versus having it written down, right? Like mRNA vaccines are sort of working memory. DNA-based vaccines are sort of, there's a hard copy there. RNA is really unstable, which is one of the reasons that RNA-based vaccines have taken a while to sort of come to fruition, because just the storage and how much RNA do you need to inject and how do we best get that RNA to get into the cells, because if it circulates throughout the body and the bloodstream, it's just going to get degraded, because that's what happens to endogenous RNA. So there is no good reason to think that if we give you an RNA-based vaccine and then boost you with a DNA-based vaccine, or boost you with a subunit vaccine, or even a weakened virus, if we were to ever get to sort of that sort of situation, all of those should elicit a very similar immune response and sort of reinforce the immune response of that previous exposure in the same way that a booster shot would. Like, think about your childhood vaccine schedule. There were probably times when some of us received different versions of that vaccine. And I'm going to switch over to a different one because I just noticed. No. Excel one. Transition. My Surface disconnected. Do I want that one? No. I want browser. I'll switch to that. Why not? And I'll get my other computer reconnected. Like, really, Kyle, what are you doing? So yeah, you can probably mix and match vaccines. The thing to note though is we haven't done trials on mixing and matching vaccines, right? So we don't know the efficacy if you were to switch from Pfizer to Moderna or something like that. But this is why scientists don't like to say, yeah, it'll work. But instead we like to say, we would like to do the trial and be able to actually give you the hard numbers for that. But the practical sort of solution is that it should work if you mix from one vaccine to another. And the reality of it is that we're going to have those trials done, because science doesn't end at the end of that trial or at the end of that study, right? The data collection of science continues on, and there will be people who did not get exposed to the same vaccine twice. It was written down wrong, or they moved in between getting that second dose, and they happened to get whatever dose was available. Those people we're going to see still have a pretty robust immunity, and it's probably better to get 2 doses rather than 1, and it's going to enhance that. And thousands and thousands of people are essentially going to sort of fill up this data set. Just like, there's no good reason for us to think that it's not going to work in children very well, but the trials haven't been done on children, and we would like to know, do they need a different dosing regimen? Do they need it more spread out? Do they need a higher or lower dose? What do we need to tweak to change the efficacy? But the sort of basic understanding is that it should work quite well. In perfect supply, if you had your choice, would you accept any vaccine compared to the others? I would take whichever vaccine was available to me. Honestly, like, whether it was AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, if it was, the Russian or Chinese versions or something like that with their vaccine, just like whatever vaccine passes Health Canada standards is not going to harm me in any way, or at least the harm is almost insignificant compared to the good that's done by reducing my chances of getting COVID-19. and that it's really just going to be about how quickly can we get everyone vaccinated. Think about like your phone. Some people like iPhones, some people like Android phones, some people like flip phones or whatever it might be, right? The point isn't we want to get you the type of phone that fits your hand the best, is going to protect you, or it's going to, have the camera you want or the apps or stuff. It might be we want to get a phone in the hand of every person so that we can send them that notification, right? And we're like, it doesn't matter if the screen is small or big or whether it's fast or slow, just if it can receive this notification of like runs the COVID alert app or something like that, that's all we need, right? So when it comes to a vaccine, whichever one you get is going to be the one that is best for you at that point in time. If in the future, a year from now, where we can be picking and choosy and you could be like, which one do I want? Realistically, it's probably not going to make a whole lot of difference anyway. It might later on once we look at getting a booster shot. And this was sort of leading into another question, I think, saying like, are we going to get a yearly vaccine like a flu shot type of thing? So I would expect that with our RNA-based vaccines, and I'm going to switch back to this one. Boom. So mRNA vaccines. You can think of them as information. So what they do is they bring in how your cell is going to make spike protein, and this information is synthesized into RNA really inorganically. We can assemble RNA and DNA molecules with essentially automated processes and organic chemistry. It doesn't need to be done by expressing it in living cells and things like that. And that's one of the reasons that these mRNA vaccines are so powerful, is that the information can be edited sort of mid-process. So we can edit, we can update, we can mix. So we can make a different RNA sequence. In the case of B117 or what's it, B135, the UK variant, South African variant, Brazil, there's a California variant now. Looks like there could potentially be a variant coming out of New York. Each of these, out of the thousands of letters of information, we can tweak and change individual letters or delete a few letters in that RNA sequence, and that will change the spike protein that your body generates when you get that new version of the vaccine. So the mRNA-based vaccines are going to be the quickest to adapt to new strains, and even just last week there was news coming out that the South African variant, Moderna, is starting to do clinical trials where essentially they tweaked that little bit of sequence, they tweaked that little bit of information using the same process to generate the RNA, inject it into people. Conceivably, it should work with the same safety profile. There's no reasonable expectation that it should have to go through the lengthy trials again, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, to see is it safe? Because all we did was change like a few letters in the RNA, and that will change the spike protein that gets produced. The spike protein that gets produced, people infected with that variant are already making that spike protein. So we know that the immune response to that spike protein isn't creating any catastrophic autoimmunity or anything like that, right? So putting that information into the vaccine is going to make the same protein as what those people getting infected with the variant have anyway. So very easy to edit, very easy to update. We can mix and match. We can actually put in a wild type variant sequence, some of this B117, some of this B135, all of these sort of variants. We could mix these into sort of a multi-subunit vaccine in the same way that a lot of vaccines, like our seasonal flu vaccine, it doesn't protect you from just one flu strain, it usually has an influenza A and an influenza B. It could have a couple different influenzas A's. If we think about the genital wart vaccine, I forget the name of it, to prevent cervical cancer and all that, that's got like a dozen different strains or something in it. And it's because, they all block against essentially the same virus, but different sort of surfaces of that virus, the proteins that are produced. Good for me for not remembering stuff. So when it comes to boosters, yeah, we'll probably want the one that is the refreshed model or the mRNA vaccine, but for just getting us to herd immunity, any vaccine is going to be a good vaccine. Do I think that we are going to be doing yearly updates like the flu shot? The flu actually mutates or varies in its type that's circulating a lot faster than most diseases because we have a lot of natural reservoirs of influenza. Influenza is naturally occurring in pigs, it's naturally occurring in ducks, it's naturally occurring in sort of other mammalian and bird species. And one of the crappy things, one of the great things for influenza but bad things for us, is that the virus actually has a segmented or multi-part genome. Its nucleic acids, its information here, are actually broken into multiple pieces. So what happens is if a person is infected with two different flus, you can have a new virus created that mixes and matches from those two flus. So that can lead to much faster evolution in flu. Instead of what we call antigenic drift, a small change over time where, we get a new strain and it changed one amino acid on the surface, but most of your immunity is going to still recognize that flu and get rid of it. We can get these large scale changes that create essentially like, now there's this new flu that's going to be circulating that most people have not been exposed to very recently. And because of the seasonality of influenza and because generally humanity has not tried to go to influenza zero, influenza migrates with human migration patterns and also the seasonality of when people are closer in proximity and breathing indoor air versus more outdoor air. So in the case of North America, influenza season is fall and winter, right? In the case of like South America, Australia, it's flipped over so that in our summer, they're going to be having higher influenza. In sort of tropical regions, it's usually in the rainy periods that people are getting more influenza, and it might be because they're just indoors more. And we think about like, how much more are you rebreathing air, right? So influenza, we have to update every year because there's just so much flu out there and so many different strains, new strains coming in through different species and recombination of strains that we just always need to be keeping ahead of it. With our COVID-19, our SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, if we can get the numbers down low enough, we might not have very rapid development of variants of concern. And we could have these multi-year sort of vaccinations where it just turns out that like maybe 10 years later, we'll have another variant that starts to come up and it, started in a particular hotspot where they didn't have good vaccination or something like that. But conceivably, we might have a much more spread out vaccine schedule, even if we do updates. And if we do updates, mRNA will be faster to update, but also we can think about, seasonality. We're probably going to have low transmission rates in the summer. Maybe we will have sort of a seasonal one. And maybe we'll actually integrate it into our influenza vaccines, right? There's no reason to think that if people are coming in for one flu vaccine booster, that we couldn't also put in a COVID booster as well, right? Even potentially if they were different types. Can go to the next questions. How does AstraZeneca hold up against the UK variant or the South African variant? AstraZeneca was doing trials in South Africa when the variant was coming about, and what they saw was that it only, before they pulled their trial, dropped transmission rates by like 10% or 20% or something ridiculous like that. It just was not working very well. It looks like the part of the spike that people were recognizing from that vaccine had been modified enough in the variant that it wasn't preventing symptomatic infection. They didn't let the trial go to see if it would prevent hospitalization or death, really. So it could still be that it is a life-saving vaccine, even if it turns out not to be a asymptomatic producing or blocks infection entirely vaccine. Hi, dog. And what we know about the Brazil variant. So the UK variant, it looks like it's actually doing quite well. The Brazil variant, there's good indications just from the reinfections that were found in Brazil that you might have individuals who are reinfected. So I'll sort of explain this a little bit better. I think it was in Manaus, is that in Brazil? They actually, because of just a lack of healthcare, a lack of education, I think it was Manaus, Brazil, they hit herd immunity, where they had, in some populations, 60 to 70% of people got infected with the first wave of wild-type COVID. I talk a lot with my hands. I notice that when I'm wearing a glove. So essentially, their outbreak became self-limiting by just the fact that so many people were infected in that first wave, and it crashed itself down really without any sort of massive additional lockdowns or interventions. But it was very deadly, right? 8 months, 9 months later, when the Brazil variant came about, they saw a large number of reinfections. So it would stand to sort of make logical sense from that if people are getting reinfected, partially it could be that the immunity that they had from the previous infection did not last long enough. And then the second thing could be that there's enough change in that variant that it was able to really evade the immune system and not be neutralized by the currently sort of circulating antibodies and things like that. And I don't know a lot of good data off the top of my head on the severity of these reinfections, but people were getting reinfected is pretty apparent. So it looks like the Brazil variant might not be as effectively blocked by our current first generation vaccines, but is probably still going to be something useful to have, right? Anything that can drop our numbers down. Why are people transmitting vagina? I sort of went through that. Promising drugs like fluoxamine or ivermectin. I actually haven't heard of fluoxamine. Ivermectin. Ivermectin is a anti-parasitic. It is, I think it paralyzes worms and things like that. So it's often used as an animal dewormer for like tapeworms, pinworms, things like that. I actually have some in my fridge from back when we had pigs, but we don't have pigs anymore, so it just sits there. But I haven't used it because I don't believe that ivermectin works. Ivermectin is sort of what hydroxychloroquine would have been without Trump. So think about all of that mess that we had with hydroxychloroquine. So there was a little bit of data at the start that showed that in test tube sort of studies, hydroxychloroquine could block the binding of the virus to the surface receptor, and this would lower the rate of transmission or something like that. And people are like, well, let's just use it on people. It's an existing drug, so let's sort of put it out. And a lot of clinical trials were started. And in some of the bigger ones, it was found that like it looks like it doesn't reduce the rate of death. If anything, maybe it might slightly increase the rate of death in some studies, but it doesn't look like it increases survivability. And people were like, well, you didn't give it early enough, or things like that. But like the data in the clinical trials never really showed that hydroxychloroquine was highly effective. The data in clinical trials for Dex, which is a dexamethasone steroid that they give to COVID patients to help them breathe better, that has been found to be highly effective. It doesn't prevent COVID, it doesn't cure COVID, but you give it to patients, patients survive more often. And this has become part of standard medical practice, right? Same for proning, for when people are on oxygen and they're laying on their front as opposed to their back, they get better oxygen saturation laying on their fronts. Hospitals started using that because when people were like, that works. Hydroxychloroquine, there was not really great evidence, and ivermectin is the same type of thing. There was initial in vitro data, test tube type data saying like it might block the reproduction of the virus in cells, but when people have gone and done the trials, and there are, in some clinical trials sort of list, there's like 50 different trials or more that have been started. Some might show a little bit of promise. Others are like, it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of effectiveness here. The other thing about ivermectin is because you can buy it off the shelf, you could go to PV Mart or Early's and buy ivermectin. I think I got mine at Early's. And in a lot of countries, it is sold as just like you can go to the pharmacy and sort of say what drug you want, and you can say, I need dewormer, and get ivermectin. People have been taking it off label, and it doesn't look like those people have had better outcomes than people who just get regular medical care and get Dex and get prone and get put on oxygen, things like that. It's probably not blocking infection, and there doesn't appear to be a lot of strong evidence that it's actually improving outcomes. Fluxamine. Should I look up fluxamine, or should I just say I'll check it out later? I'm going to type it in just to see what it does. Are we sure it's fluxamine? Nothing comes up. Maybe I'll search instead for. I have not heard about it, but if it's really important, send me a DM in Twitter and I will take a look into that, but I haven't heard of that one. So the endemics, I'm still working down the chat here. This is a good question because I like this, because this is like what's going to happen in the far off future. Will COVID become endemic? So, if we want to think about, like, I run scenarios in my head all the time of like, given this, like, what's the likely outcome? My end game that I think is something that we're going to edge towards is first world countries do mass vaccination. We push that out to the other countries that are going to be not as rich, slower to vaccinate, the ones that we provide through COVAX and things like that, right? We know that in order to control COVID, we are going to need to have as many people vaccinated as possible, because it's obvious that if we allow 1 million people or 10 million people around the world to be constantly infected because they live on the boundaries of society where we have not vaccinated them, this will generate new strains, right? So we do need to hit like herd immunity worldwide. Once we do that, could new strains come out? Could individuals' immunity drop down so that people could get infected? Yes, but probably a reinfected individual is going to have a milder immune response because some of that partial immunity might just help their immune system catch up to the virus faster. And the other thing is what we might see is children who, if we think about a lot of childhood diseases where if you get infected with a particular virus like chickenpox as a child, you're having a lot less severity of illness than if you were infected as an adult. And we might get to this point with COVID where we know that it causes asymptomatic or very mild symptomatic illness in children. It might get to be an endemic illness where everyone in adulthood has been vaccinated or infected and has fairly good immunity. And in children, maybe their immunity wanes faster, maybe we don't always vaccinate them quick enough. They might create this pool of COVID where we might not notice that it's actually circulating because their symptoms are so mild. Or we might just sort of say it's now, yes, an endemic mild illness, and we've protected all the people who needed to be protected, and now it's no worse than a cold. Like that could be sort of one of the potential things here. So I think we might do updated vaccinations. We might get to the point where the only people getting infected are the people who have very mild symptoms. And if we just try and keep our vaccinations up, the reproductive rate, the chances of one person infecting to another are going to be very low. And it is potentially that we could, sort of burn this thing out, make it so that it won't spread from one individual to another. What do I think about Michael Mina and his testing recommendations? I think he is a great epidemiologist out of Harvard. If you haven't followed Michael Mina or seen any of his stuff, he has been a big proponent for rapid testing. And I'm going to use this as a little aside to just sort of get into like, what is rapid testing? I don't know why I'm erasing some stuff I could be. So PCR versus rapid tests. PCR-based tests, what we do is we take our swab, and in both cases we might take a swab, and here we are going to look for, I'm just going to make that a little bit smaller, look for virus RNA. A rapid test, we're going to look for virus proteins. So thinking about our virus, our SARS-CoV-2 here, let's put some RNA inside. PCR-based testing, how it works is we strip off all the stuff outside of the virus so that in our test tube we've got the RNA, and then we convert that RNA to a DNA sequence, and then using PCR, which you've heard about probably, we look at some locations within that sequence. And you can imagine it's like making a copy of just one spot or a copy of another spot here. And we go from one copy to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16, 32, 64, doubling. And as the DNA in this tube is made, the tube becomes glowy. It becomes fluorescent. There is a dye that inserts itself in between the base pairs of DNA, thinking about like a ladder and sticking your hands and your feet through the sort of spaces between the rungs. And when this dye is inside of DNA, it glows more brightly. So if we were to have a machine that's making a copy, measuring the glow, makes a copy again, measures the glow again, what we would see is that initially the glowing is almost nothing, too low to measure. And then we hit this transition period where it starts to increase, and then it maxes out. Because there's only so much DNA that PCR can make within a test tube before the sort of balance in the cells wears off type of thing. We don't need to worry about it too much, but like there's an upper limit of what can be made. So a positive test doesn't have to reach the top. What we do is we say a positive test has to break through a threshold by a certain cycle number. So we could say that if by cycle 30 we have a fluorescence, an amount of glowing that's above this line, that has created a positive test. If after 30 cycles we haven't reached that level of glowing, we consider that a negative test. And that's where that sort of cycle threshold or CT value that people like to sort of talk about and sort of complain about, saying it's too high or whatever it might be. Like, people have used these tubes and these reagents to set up this experiment in your lab, and they have validated that a positive crosses the threshold when it's a true positive and a negative doesn't. So they've sort of figured out that the CT value for that lab might be 32, it might be 35, it might be that their tubes are thicker so the temperature doesn't transfer through, or it might be that they use a higher volume, or different things can change what this is. Kind of like saying, like, you know, cars come in different sizes, right? It might be a 4-seater versus a 7-seater. Like, you wouldn't say that that car doesn't work or that it can transfer more people. You know, it's just about it works, right? Like, we've validated this. But how does the rapid testing work? So rapid testing is not as sensitive as PCR-based testing. Rapid testing, looking for the virus proteins present on the swab, has to use antibodies to bind those. There's no copying that gets made. So essentially what you have in a rapid test is you've got this sample loading area, kind of like in a pregnancy test where you would pee on it, but in this case we sort of take a swab, stick it in a tube with a bit of buffer, we put that liquid onto that spot, and then the liquid sort of transfers through and flows up. And it passes a position where we have antibodies, these Y-shaped structures that your immune system makes that bind to foreign things, right? And then we have typically 2 lines here, one which is our control line and one which is our actual test line. So if there was virus in your swab that is now in the tube that gets applied to this region, that virus passes those antibodies, and then the virus has antibodies that stick to it. And then those keep going, and typically they will get trapped at this test position. And the antibody that has been trapped with it will have a color changing agent on it. Sometimes they use different metals, sometimes it's an enzyme, but like it makes a colorful line in the same way that a pregnancy test generates a line, and the intensity of the line like doesn't really matter as much. It's just if you see a line, it's positive. If you don't see a line, it's negative. And then if that doesn't work, it gets trapped up here on the second position, which is our control line, which tells us that the test worked. So the test should always have the control line, and if it was a positive, it's also going to show up on the test line. Because this actually is an antibody sticking to a virus, sticking to that spot on the line, you need a certain amount of virus in that swab in order to generate a positive result. And if we were to look at a standard infection, so thinking about virus shedding versus time, you get infected at day 0, your virus shedding is 0, right? Like there's no virus there. And we know that with COVID, typically 2 to 3 days after infection is when we start to reach our sort of transmissible period where we can infect someone else. And then it typically spikes up, and then usually sort of by day 10 of symptoms, you are no longer infectious. And this is why we sort of went to this like 10-day recovery, is that there's good evidence that people who have had COVID symptoms for 10 days, the amount of virus that they're producing, even if their symptoms are continuing, the amount of virus that they're shedding, the antibodies they're making are blocking that from sort of being spread very effectively. So, but then for virus, there is this really long tail. We could detect the virus 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks in some individuals after infection. And we could say, you know what, a PCR-based test can get us a positive from really like day 2 up to day 50. An antigen-based rapid test only really gets us in this height of the peak here. It doesn't work early in infection, and it might be, I think I saw some evidence that like maybe the first 12 hours or 24 hours, you might be spreading virus, but there's not enough yet for them to actually measure it. And then by the time your immune system has kicked in and it's dropping your viral load, we again fall below that threshold. So let's say the rapid test, it needs to be above the green in order to actually give a positive. For the PCR-based test, it's really anywhere along this line. So rapid testing is not a test for are you infected? It is a test for are you infectious? Are you able to spread to other people? Which is one of the big reasons that a lot of governments were like, I don't know if I should be using, or I don't know if we should be using these tests because it might give people a false sense of security that we show them to be negative, but they just aren't positive yet. And it can't detect these late infections. And we're like, you know what? Why do we need to detect those necessarily, right? So rapid testing is good for are you infectious? And it could best be used for things like if you are going to be a visitor in long-term care, if you are transferring individuals from one confined population in a prison to another, and you were like, let's just do rapid tests on people to make sure that right now nobody's going to infect someone else. If we did it at schools, you know, we could say who in this school population is asymptomatic, because we know that kids are low on symptoms, but they also might be transmissible, or we could say those are cases that we aren't detecting symptomatically. We aren't going to do a PCR-based test on everyone because it's hard to ramp up. We don't have the time to send it off, to bring it back. It's days later, you know, hours and hours for every test in order to be processed. If we can do this 15-minute rapid test, we could say like, we just do everyone today, and anyone who comes out positive, we send them home for 10 days, right? So rapid tests definitely have a use, and Michael Mina's sort of thing is to say like, we should rapid test everybody. And in Slovakia, they actually did back in like December, they mailed out rapid tests to people and said like, even if half the people screw up this test, they don't do it right, they don't know what they're doing, they mess it up entirely, if we catch the other half of the positives of the transmissible people, and we can get them to voluntarily isolate, remove themselves from the population, and break half of the chains of transmission, that is going to, you know, very effectively drop our numbers of people circulating COVID, right? Because the thing to note, the biggest worry, like something that I think people forget about even, yeah, I'm gonna change to, I don't know, is this window here, pre-symptoms. We know that even in someone who is going to become symptomatic, you could have a couple of days where you are transmitting virus but haven't yet noticed, or don't have strong enough symptoms, or maybe you never will get symptoms. But it's this pre-symptomatic interval which leads to probably the vast majority right now of our transmissions. It's that people are infecting others before they even know about it. In the case of kids or young adults, it could be that you are never symptomatic, and that you're, if you think about, maybe this is a dual graph here, the blue is how much virus is going to be produced. I am going to draw another graph. I'm going to zoom it out. Some people, let's go time and symptom severity, SympSev. So let's imagine, got this blue region, green region, red region here. Each person's an individual. We know that the older you are, the more severe your symptoms will be, but it doesn't have this direct correlation, right? You can think about, like, if you were to go skiing and you didn't know whether you were getting on the lift for the Bunny Hill or the Black Diamond, right? Like, you never know which hill you might be ending up to go down when you first get COVID. So some people are going to persist in this asymptomatic domain, where just they never, even though they're transmitting lots of virus, never accumulate symptoms, and just sort of, that's the way their immune system has reacted. Some people go up like this. Some people go up to here and die. Some people sort of go up to the precipice and come back down, right? We don't know which one of these roller coasters you personally are going to be on if you get COVID, but we know that if you don't get COVID, it won't be any of them, right? That's why we want to block these infections. But if we think about the usefulness of rapid testing, it's we can get all of these people who are transmitting virus to not transmit to other people, and whether they're symptomatic or not, we can sort of remove them from that sort of propagation population. Because all of these people have some region of time where they might be transmitting virus but not yet symptomatic. That's what makes COVID-19 just such an effective virus. If you think about the original SARS back in the sort of early 2000s, was very deadly. And the reason that we were able to contain it is because people always became symptomatic a few days before they became transmissible. So with COVID-19, transmit first, symptoms second. In the case of SARS, related virus, it was symptomatic first and transmissible second. If someone's symptomatic and then transmissible, when someone has symptoms, you don't let them spread to other people, right? It's easy to block the chains of transmission because it's the people who are visibly sick. In the case of COVID-19, you're transmissible first. You've got that window of potentially days where you can spread it to others. And that means we're always a few days behind the next round of infection. So his recommendations that we should use more rapid testing, absolutely. But people need to know that it doesn't tell us whether you have ever been infected. It doesn't tell us necessarily that tomorrow you might not come out positive. Rapid testing should be used as a right now, when you're at this party, let's say. Actually, an example I gave to a reporter once when I was doing an interview was to say, nobody wants to go to a funeral. People are obligated to go to a funeral because the person that you love has died, right? If we could have a situation in the province where we supplied rapid tests to people at funeral homes, where we said, we know that you're not really choosing to be here, but it is something that, morally, ethically, you feel you're obligated to say goodbye. If we could rapid test people at the door and say, if you come up positive, I'm sorry, you can't attend. That would block those types of super spreader events, right? Or if you could do that at a hockey tournament potentially, right? You could say, we will test you, and for the next 6 hours, that's your ticket to say that yes, you're negative. 6 hours from now, you could start to be transmitting virus. This doesn't tell us if you've been infected. It tells us whether you're infectious, right? And right now you're not infectious, so that's what that negative would be good for. But that's why these rapid tests are like one of these keys, one of these tools that we are not utilizing very well. People who take ACE inhibitors at greater risk for severe COVID? I actually don't know the answer to that. So I know that ACE is the receptor on the surface. I don't know how it modifies people. And I haven't really heard about that, which you would think that if there was a great difference found between people who are on ACE inhibitors and people who aren't, that you would, like, it would have come out in the news. So it might be that there just haven't been enough cases that have been found or enough differences in severity. Switch to single shot versus... So Andrea sort of made this comment. I don't know if it was a comment or a question. It sort of helps as a question mark at the end. Single shot versus double shot protocols. It's sort of this, do we want good immunity in fewer people, or do we want broad immunity that might not be as effective in just more of a spread? So 1 versus 2 shots. So the clinical trials that have been done were using a set protocol for timing between the first and second shot. And because these clinical trials were done as quickly as humanly possible, they really looked at like a 3-week or 4-week interval from the first to the second shot, just because they were like, we could wait 3 months between shots, but that adds 2 more months into our phase 1 trial, 2 more months into our phase 2 trial, 2 more months into our phase 3 trial. That's 6 more months of time, and we need vaccines now, right? So they actually compressed the sort of spacing between the 2 shots to as little as they could sort of think like that should still work. And we don't want to modify that necessarily because we haven't tested the efficacy of a 42-day interval or a 70-day interval or a 100-day interval, right? Realistically, it should still work. It's unlikely that your immunity is going to drop off between months 1 and 2 very much. So that second shot should still boost instead of just being, you know, we gave you a shot, it completely wore away before we gave you the second, and then we're like, it's just like we're giving you a first shot a second time. We want that second shot to reinforce immunity, right? So we want sort of the antibodies that your body's making to like sort of say the first shot comes in, you start to make them. So let's say first shot happens here, second shot happens here, and then you already have some circulating antibodies, and then that second shot gives you like this boost, right? Like it lasts longer, we get this stronger response. So if we increase this spacing, does that make it so that that boost doesn't happen? And, you know, if you waited 5 years, yeah, it probably would. If you waited 2 months, unlikely. If we have a really limited amount of vaccine and we're only vaccinating the most vulnerable individuals, people 80 and above, people in long-term care, people in racialized communities, people who have less easy access to healthcare because they live in remote communities, whatever the sort of case may be, where we know those outcomes are going to be worse, you don't want to give them one shot and not the second, because it's not just about that boost, but it's because we know that in maybe 10% or 20% of the population, that first shot might not give any immunity, but the second sort of is, if it's 90% effective and then the second one is another 90%, 90% and 90%, like gets us up to like 99, right? It's like 90% of that 10% remaining. So we know in vulnerable populations, you want to get the second shot because that is, it's like seatbelt and airbag, right? If one fails, the other is there as this backup to make sure that we're in there. But that doubles up the number of shots we need to give to each person. So One shot, definitely for vulnerable. Two shots, this can get us faster, wider immunity. Sort of herd faster. It seems like that is something that would be a good strategy for different countries, communities, provinces, health regions, whoever's sort of making these decisions. It hasn't been done in the trial, so we don't know what the efficacy will be, but people have done the modeling and said, like, even if it is 80% versus 93% effective, if you can get twice as many people at 80% protection rather than half as many people at 93, twice as many people at 80% is 160 people per million or whatever. Bad math there. A million people injected twice at 91% will be 910,000. Let's do it that way with real math, huh? So, two shot. Let's say we were doing 93% efficiency and we did 1 million. That's 930,000, right? And then let's say we went to a one-shot regimen, and let's say it was only 60% effective, but we do 2 million people. That is going to give us 101,200,000 people that are protected. Boom. So in that case, a two-shot regimen is going to slow down our transition to herd immunity. It's going to generate more cases. We're going to have more adverse effects, right? But it doesn't necessarily guarantee protection for 800,000 people, right? Here, only 70,000 people weren't protected. Here, 800,000 people are not protected. But the overall number is better, right? There's good case to be made that in non-vulnerable people, people below the age of 60, people below the age of 50, maybe people below the age of 40, whatever it might be, giving them one shot to twice as many people could get us to the end line faster, that herd immunity, and then we could backfill with a second shot, right? Because more doses will be coming in. Like, what will get us to crushing the curve the fastest? It's probably a good combination between double shot for the vulnerable and one shot for the less vulnerable. And that's, a great thing about clinical trials is that tells us where to start, but countries are going to modify their procedures, and we are going to, over the next month, 2 months, 3 months, generate data where we can say how many people, once we had 1 million people get the first shot, did end up getting infected versus how many people getting the second shot got infected. What was the true difference in sort of susceptibility, and how many people who got that first shot had severe disease after versus just getting infected? Like, we will start to sort of retool those standards of practice of how we should vaccinate people based on just the continual observations that we're doing. How are we going to get more people to vaccinate? So just reading to the comments, now if 30 people won't get the first shot and telling your mom you won't get it, like, there was good reason, I think, for standard public, people who don't want to read clinical trials and things like that to say, I've never heard of an mRNA vaccine. This was rushed, and say, like, I'm not taking that, right? So I'm gonna write down vaccine rushed and guinea pigs. It's a reasonable worry to say, here is something that a year ago no human had ever been exposed to, and now we're just going to inject it into 1 billion people, ideally 5 billion people or more, right? And you can say, well, I don't want to be the first. So the phase 1 and phase 2 trials don't just look at efficacy. Really, starting off at the phase 1, it's about safety. Does this vaccine create a problem in the people that we're actually vaccinating? Does it create autoimmunity? Does it, there are cases in vaccines where you get Guillain-Barré syndrome, where your antibodies that you generate attack the myelin on your nerves and you get this paralysis that sort of works its way up from your feet. And there are cases of vaccine injury where you get autoimmunity, where your antibodies attack like the endothelial cells of your blood vessels and things like that. Like, in some people, their immune system just does the wrong thing with a vaccine. And we look for those. And not just in phase 1, in phase 2, in phase 3, we constantly measure those things because we can pull back a vaccine. And these are usually very quite fast sort of things that happen. There aren't really great examples of vaccine injury that happens like 5 years later or something like that, but people have looked for this. And in the mRNA-based vaccines and in the other vaccines, they have passed phase 1, 2, 3 trials for safety first and then for efficacy. So not only does it not cause harm, but does it limit the amount of disease. The efficacy for the flu vaccine, typically, if it is 50% reduction in like symptoms and transmissions, that's good. That's sort of what we use to say, that's a good, effective seasonal flu vaccine. We are hitting higher than that with our 60, 70, 90% ones here. But when it comes to adverse effects, it really looks like there are no more adverse effects for these vaccines than for most others. There were some examples of anaphylactic reactions. Yes, that is why when you get vaccinated, you sit there for 15 minutes, because an anaphylactic reaction can be deadly, but it comes about quickly, and they have EpiPens where they are vaccinating people. Like, they are ready and looking for that. I actually was pacing around the house earlier today, and I was like, people talk about like the safety of the vaccine, and it's like if you went to a NASA engineer and you were like, I know you built that rocket ship, but have you considered the possibility that it could get a leak and all of the air could leak out of the spaceship and people would die? What if that happens? Shouldn't we be on the lookout for that? Nobody has ever flown in this particular spaceship before. And a NASA engineer would say, that's the first thing we look for, right? Like, this isn't our first time building a spaceship. We know that that is a risk. Explosive decompression, too much oxygen and everyone burns up, or whatever it might be. Or like, we know, and we look for that, and we test for that, and we monitor for that, right? We look for adverse side effects with vaccination. We have been monitoring for those. There are millions of individuals now who have received some type of COVID vaccine, and it is not an issue. It has not become an issue that there are that many people having an adverse effect. One of the problems is that if you vaccinate 1 million people, some of them will die a week later, because some of them, even in the absence of vaccination, would die a week later, especially when you're vaccinating people who are 80, 90, 100 years old, right? So what you have to look for is, does the rate of these adverse effects increase compared to what we would expect from those individuals? So people just get Guillain-Barré and have paralysis. Does the rate of that, is it exceeded when people are vaccinated? It doesn't look like that. So it doesn't look like there are any safety problems. And this was getting into like, why were people cautious at first? Because it did seem to be rushed. It wasn't rushed because the things that slow down vaccination sort of development are funding and prevalence and volunteers. Why does a vaccine take so long to develop? One, money. Millions or billions of dollars. In the case of COVID, there was no limitation to the amount of money that scientists had, that biotech companies had to try and develop these vaccines, right? Like, economies are losing billions and billions of dollars, putting 100 million into R&D even if that company doesn't get a vaccine, makes sense, right? So funding became essentially an unlimited step, or a not rate limiting step. There was no wait for more funding. Prevalence: if you are trying to generate a vaccine against a disease that isn't actively spreading, you need to wait for a certain number of people in the control group to become infected, and a certain number of people, hopefully, in the vaccine group have not. 100 cases in this group, 20 cases in this group, we say, oh, that dropped by 80% the number of people that got infected, right? If we are doing a vaccine for something like Ebola, and it's not currently spreading, there's no outbreaks, and then we're like, we might need to wait years to see if those cases come about, right? In the case of COVID, there were thousands and thousands of cases being created everywhere that we were doing these clinical trials. So the prevalence was not a rate limiting step. It wasn't something slowing us down, because people were getting infected, and we could see those endpoints faster, that in our vaccinated group and in our non-vaccinated group, for the first week, the rate of people getting COVID appeared to be the same. In our non-vaccinated group, that continued up. In our vaccinated group, that flattened, because 2 weeks after getting the vaccine, people were immune, right? And then we say, how many people after 3 months, and figure out our efficacy there. Next, volunteers. People did not need to be hounded to potentially take this vaccine, right? Even if it was 1% of individuals who were like, yeah, I'm willing to go and test out this vaccine because maybe I'm in a high-risk group, or maybe I'm just worried about it, or maybe I just have a good understanding of science and I trust it. But there was no waiting for volunteers. People were willing to be in parts of those trials. So while it only took 10, 11, 12 months for the first vaccines to go from RNA sequence data on a computer to 2 months later having a phase 1 vaccine, RNA that we're injecting, to 6 months later submitting that phase 3 clinical trial data, like, there was no pause in any of that. It was just done as quickly, as safely humanly possible. And then when we got to like December and people were like, I don't know if this has really been tested, it had already been tested on hundreds of thousands of individuals with no adverse effects above and beyond what was found in people who were getting the placebo. And now we've got millions of individuals. One of the best sort of things about vaccine hesitancy is that not only did we vaccinate old people first, people high risk, but we vaccinated healthcare workers, because we know that a healthcare worker outbreak, if that's something that we haven't limited, could reduce our number of life-saving personnel, right? So we don't want people to die, but we also need people who can provide medical care. And in vaccinating healthcare workers, because they are typically more educated about science, they have a higher trust for science, they know how trials work, there were more people in the community who were willing to take that vaccine, and they are essentially our like spokespeople, right? Like, think about the thousands of doctors in Saskatchewan and nurses and, frontline healthcare workers, people who are giving the vaccinations, people who are doing the testing, all of that, who are vaccinated now, who are essentially these walking billboards for, I took the vaccine, I'm fine, I'm protected, you should be protected too, right? So I think vaccine hesitancy did have that sort of natural, people are going to be a little more hesitant at the start, but it's coming down. And I think that by the time most 20-year-olds are able to get vaccinated, I think probably the majority of them will go to get vaccinated, even though COVID isn't really high risk for them, because they'll understand like all these other people have been vaccinated and they haven't had those adverse effects. What am I gonna go to next? Why do I sing? Because I like to. Come on. Recovery time. U.S. approved Johnson & Johnson last night. I think that we're still looking at like efficacy data and stuff like that for Johnson & Johnson. So both the we've got Pfizer, and we've got Moderna. I hate that they have two names. We've got our Johnson & Johnson, and we've got AstraZeneca. Both Pfizer and Moderna are mRNA-based vaccines. Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca are both a DNA in a non-dangerous virus that I'll put smiley faces. The mRNA in the case of the Johnson & Johnson is packaged up in like lipid nanoparticles, or sorry, Pfizer, Moderna. So the mRNA ones, the lipids help it fuse to your cells, essentially like kind of like two bubbles merging together into a bigger bubble. That brings the RNA into your cells. The RNA gets converted into protein, which is our spikes. In the case of the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca, this happy virus, which is an adenovirus that has been used for gene therapy, that we know it doesn't create a strong immune response. It's also been stripped down so that it's not a virus anymore. It's not even reproductive. It's just essentially a vehicle, kind of like a little syringe to help it get into your cells. But the DNA is going to get converted into RNA, which then gets converted into protein, which again is spike. DNA wrapped up in a virus is much more stable, temperature stable, and time duration stable than messenger RNA. So both the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca are probably going to be the mass-produced vaccine. And also because they're made by these viruses, we can sort of grow them in cell culture and use like Serum Institute in India, which is like this massive vaccine producing sort of industry. They can sort of make billions of doses opposed to Pfizer and Moderna that, have a hard time making hundreds of thousands of doses per week type of thing. But these are going to be a lot more temperature stable. So, fridge temperatures 2 to 8 degrees for like a month or more type of thing. These are the vaccines that we can take to places without electricity. It can be kept in a cooler on ice, and that could be carried out somewhere where it's a days-long trip to then vaccinate those populations. The Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca are really going to be like the everyman type of vaccine, as opposed to the sort of privileged few vaccine, which is the Pfizer and Moderna. So I don't know where we are on Johnson & Johnson approval in Canada. I think that, we're looking through all the data. And a nice thing about Johnson & Johnson is it's a single dose. So their clinical trial was set up to essentially say, we're going to inject people once and see how it goes. And it's, again, looking to be probably in this like 60 to 70% range, but that is effective enough to reach herd immunity or get that assist with pre-existing infections to get herd immunity. But, it doesn't hurt to have a fourth vaccine. And we're probably in Canada going to have a fourth vaccine. And all of these, any one you can get should be the one that you try to get, right? You don't want to be shopping around and saying, if I wait a month, I could get this other one that I believe in a little more. But in that month, I have a chance of getting infected and potentially becoming a hospitalized case or dying, right? Like, we want to try and sort of blanket our population with vaccination as quickly as possible. Mandy asks, what other applications do you see mRNA being used for? The downside of mRNA is how unstable it is. So it can't be used for an effective like gene therapy. Like, conceivably you could say like, what if you had someone who was a diabetic and you gave them the mRNA to make insulin and somehow targeted it to the pancreas or something like that? Like, the mRNA wouldn't last more than probably a few hours within the cells and get expressed to produce much insulin. So it can't be like a permanent fix in the way that gene therapy, like something like this could potentially have persistent sort of expression of, the DNA stays in the cells and it keeps to make protein. But mRNA is going to be this agile method of vaccination that I could see us going to influenza vaccination that is mRNA based. Previously, our old influenza vaccines were good enough, and we had enough lead time with the seasonality that typically we've got, 6 months from the end of one flu season till the start of the other one to sort of say what flus are circulating in China and Australia right now. Let's make sure that our vaccine protects against those ones, because those are the ones that are going to come here through travel. If we went to an mRNA-based vaccine and we had a Canadian manufacturer, we could say what influenza is circulating now at the start of the season, and we could boost people, especially vulnerable people, with that new strain information and essentially have this like really agile, adept, like, turning on a dime type of vaccination. So I could see mRNA becoming more of any vaccine that we need to update, that's going to allow us to update very rapidly. Conceivably, like, think about 50 years in the future. The technology to generate the mRNA could be shrunk down essentially into a, like, if not a vending machine, if, maybe a flatbed truck type of thing, right? Where you could sort of, through the internet, beam, this is the sequence that you're going to assemble, make some messenger RNA in this factory contained within this, back of a truck or, building or, storefront or things like that, and say, like, we are essentially going to say, someone in your area got the cold. We sequenced that cold. We figured out what cold it is of the 200 viruses that causes a cold. We said, that's the one circulating in Saskatoon. We're going to push to Saskatoon a vaccine made of mRNA that only targets that strain that's circulating. And, maybe people could, like, pick it up, or maybe it gets couriered to the doctors or something like that. It's like, boom, there you go. We can, like, vaccinate people. Or maybe we'll have a robot that does it. You just go wait in line, insert your card or whatever, and it, like, updates you with the latest vaccine. So I think that, our ability to innovate vaccines faster with mRNA is probably going to be our best use case for it, not anything that needs to be, we're going to use the same vaccine for years and years and years because these are a lot easier to mass produce, and it just makes sense to me that way. Reading Meat's question here. It's just a thank you. How exactly does the antibody against the spike protein work? Is it blocking receptor binding domain? Does the mRNA code for the whole protein or just a part of the spike protein? I believe that it encodes most of the spike protein. I don't know if it actually has all of it, so whether it has, like, the transmembrane domain or things that might need to be assembled into the viral particle and things like that. But, like, imagine spike protein on the surface of our virus here, right? Multiple copies of this. So a protein on the surface, we could say would be called an antigen, but an antibody doesn't bind or recognize the whole thing. The way I like to teach this to my class when I'm talking about how antibodies bind is to say, like, you might recognize someone's face, you might recognize their voice, you might recognize the sound of their footsteps, you might recognize their sneeze, you might recognize their smell, right? Your ability to recognize a person is sort of through these multiple sort of observations, right? And antibodies, when we generate them against an infection, do the same thing, in that you might make an antibody that recognizes this part of the spike and only that part, nowhere else. You might have another antibody that gets generated that actually binds to some of the, like, other proteins that make up the virus, or maybe it binds to part of this stalk domain, or maybe it binds to somewhere out here, right? And this is great for immunity because it means that if the virus changed one of these 4, as I've drawn it out, things, such as this one, let's say it's changed, the other antibodies are going to recognize their currently present things. It's like, would my kids recognize me if I shaved off my beard? Yes. Maybe if they were like, my dad's the guy over there with a beard, oh wait, he shaved it off, like someone else wouldn't recognize me if that was the only thing that they were looking for. But my kids would still be like, yeah, that's him, that's his voice, or whatever, right? So I believe that neutralizing immunity is typically when we have antibodies binding up to the spike, the part that interfaces with our cells to prevent it from being taken in. But you don't need to have that neutralizing immunity that blocks infection in order to have immunity that your T cells will target cells that are infected with the virus to kill those cells, to say, hey, of the billion cells in your body, if you 5 could die right now and not make more viruses, that would be great. That would save us, right? Like, cells are dying all the time. Your immune system, can target virally infected cells to sort of kill them off. So I think that they use most of the spike protein. The antibodies that get generated are polyclonal. They're diverse and they sort of bind multiple epitopes. And that's why something like a B117 variant, where maybe we've just cut off a little bit of the spike and altered it a little bit, antibodies that were looking for that one location maybe don't bind as well with the same affinity. They fall off more easily, or maybe they don't bind at all. But the other ones that are generated, potentially like this one there, that one there, they could still give effective immunity, which is why it's not a new strain B117, it's a new variant, because you have some cross immunity, right? So it's likely that the antibodies that we're generating are still going to give some protective immunity. Another thing is biochemists like to isolate spike protein, isolate antibodies that people have generated through vaccination, and look to see what conditions are needed to get them to fall apart or bind together. And that's where we get this information of it looks like the South African variant is, 6-fold less neutralized by the antibodies that were generated through our vaccine. And we're like, well, okay, 6-fold less, is that enough? It's enough for us to measure in an experiment, but is that enough to render your immunity useless? And that's not necessarily the case, right? Just because it binds with a lower affinity doesn't mean it doesn't bind at all, doesn't mean it can't be an effective antibody to help you nudge your own immune system over from becoming severely symptomatic to becoming even asymptomatic, or at least not able to reproduce the virus as well. I think we're kind of trailing off here. I haven't seen any new questions for a little while. And I actually, honestly, only planned on talking for an hour, but people are here, so that's awesome. I think we should do this again sometime. I think something that I would like is the ability to have at least a voice back and forth with someone who's asking a question. Because part of teaching, part of explaining anything, is getting you into flow state, where your ability to, I'm not so redundant that you're like, this is boring, this is boring, this is boring, and I'm not so high level that you're like, I missed something and I don't get it. We want you to get into this, you're anticipating what I'm saying and you're catching on, right? And that's a lot easier to do with a little more interaction. I'm going to do that one more question, Darcy. So, yes, I would like to, if I'm going to do this more in the future, have at least voice back and forth with somebody, say what do you know about this? Can we talk about that a little bit more? So Darcy say pre-existing conditions. And I'm going to assume that you mean, should people with certain pre-existing conditions get vaccinated, like autoimmunity or things like that? Or if you are on chemotherapy, is that what you're talking about, Darcy? I'm gonna have to wait 30 seconds for you to type because I put that anti-spam flood thing in there. You're welcome, people who are saying thank you. Thank you for being here. Okay, so I'm gonna go pre-existing. The worst thing. For some reason, when I'm talking and writing, that's not even a sign for writing, I skip letters, and I'm like, oh, because I was starting to vocalize the next letter before I wrote that down. So pre-existing conditions for vaccination. Okay, pre-existing conditions are the worst to have with the worst outcomes. So I'm going to quickly answer this. If you are autoimmune, so if you have like rheumatoid arthritis, if you have psoriasis, if you have multiple sclerosis, various conditions where you're making antibodies that target part of your body, and then you might be taking drugs to suppress your immune system. Typically, when it comes to vaccination, we wouldn't want to give you a live vaccine where it's like a weakened version of the virus where we're going to infect you, the virus is going to propagate, and then your immune system is going to like learn what to do. It's like throwing your kid in a swimming pool and being like, learn to swim. Doesn't work so well if they're really dense and can't, heavily dense, and just can't figure it out before they sink, right? So in the case of a live or attenuated vaccine like that, we probably would say you shouldn't be taking that vaccination if you are on some type of immunosuppressant. But in the case of both of, this is why I actually like having that. In the case of our mRNA and our DNA-based vaccines, because they don't propagate into virus, if we give them to someone who's immunocompromised, probably the worst that will happen is they don't create an effective immunity response, but they should not have any deleterious effects. And same goes for like pregnant individuals, where we can say that, the vaccine maybe hasn't been tested on those individuals, but your chances of adverse outcomes in getting COVID compared to your chances of adverse outcomes if you get the vaccine, COVID is going to be much worse for you, right? So if we can, maybe we can try and have some people sort of hold back and get vaccinated later. But there are people who are in high-risk environments, doctors and nurses who are going to be exposed to COVID, who have those conditions, and they've been vaccinated, and they are going to give us that data. There are pregnant women who, because they are in a high-risk group, have been vaccinated and will sort of show us that like there's no difference in birth weight and things like that. Like people are constantly looking for these things. But the general advice is probably that you should get vaccinated when it's your chance to get vaccinated, really irrespective of probably most conditions that you have, even if they haven't been tried. That's not medical advice. You definitely want to talk to your doctor. But as a general sort of thing, I've seen other doctors sort of advising the same types of things, saying like, the risk of COVID is much, much higher, thousands of times higher than the risk of our current understanding of adverse effects. Okay, so now pre-existing conditions for the worst outcomes. So if we think about the severity of disease, one of the problems is that we don't have a great understanding, even a year later, of why old people have so much more severity, young people don't, why certain individuals, like you could have 1,000 healthy 20-year-olds who get COVID, minimal symptoms, recover, and you could have 10 who end up being long COVID, and you have one who ends up dying, and they could appear to have been perfectly healthy beforehand. We do know that if we think about the risks of COVID, the types of damage that it does to your body, We know that it causes heart attacks and strokes. We know that it can cause, I think, liver, kidney damage. It can definitely cause lung scarring, and it can also flood the lungs with essentially like a hydrogel. Drink that down. So if you have a pre-existing condition where one of these things is slightly off, so if you think about the heart attacks and strokes, and probably a lot of the organ damage has to do with like clotting type conditions that get generated from COVID, where essentially like we're not sure if it's the virus that's circulating through your bloodstream that's actually causing some like weird aggregations and then like little clotting and things like that, but like people get more strokes and heart attacks. So if you're someone who has a pre-existing susceptibility where you had high cholesterol and atherosclerosis, if you've had strokes in the past or anything like that, you are more likely, given the same amount of thickening in your blood, to have an adverse effect, right? If you are someone who has already some pre-existing lung conditions like asthma, like recent pneumonia, where pneumonia can scar your lungs for years, so you might not notice that decrease in lung capacity or lung elasticity, that deep inhale when you sort of stretch things out, but it could be that in regular day-to-day life you seem fine. If you super exercise, your oxygen saturation drops down. But if you have COVID, you're already a little bit off balance, right? So that pre-existing lung damage, that pre-existing sort of just susceptibility of your lungs to hyperreact and generate phlegm or bronchospasm and things like that, that can be what sort of tips you over, right? But there's no hard and fast rule. There's no good, like, if you are this age and this physical condition, COVID is not going to give you any sort of problems. There are no guarantees when it comes to COVID. We just know that the probability of severity drops with age. I want to show you a graph. I'm going to give you a number, some numbers. My death tracker data. Okay. Sometimes when the province releases a modeling update, they will tell you not just how many people are in the hospital, but how many people have ever been in the hospital and things like that. So I've got a bit of this data that I'm going to show you. And I'm going to switch over to I don't know if those numbers are visible. Bigger still. Okay. Now I haven't switched it. Boom. Switch. So on January 10th, so that's this set here, there had been 3,726 COVID cases in Saskatchewan of people ages 0 to 19. 18 of those had ever been to the hospital for any length of time, and only one of those kids had been to the ICU, and nobody died, and we're still there with no deaths. So if we want to think about just hospitalizations, too small, let's write decimals, let's increase up decimals. Okay. So if you're ages 0 to 19, only 0.48%, less than 0.5% of people with COVID under the age of 19 in Saskatchewan on January 10th, up to and including 0.5% had ever had to go to the hospital. Ages 20 to 39, 1.5%. 40 to 59, about 4%. 60 to 79, 11.5%. 80 plus, 23%. So that means 77% of COVID cases 80 and above had not ever gone to the hospital. 88.5% of 60 to 79-year-olds. Probably some with identical pre-existing conditions compared to other people, right? Again, never had to go to the hospital. 99.5% of kids never had to go to the hospital. So there's no guarantees, but one of the sort of tricky triggers, something that has been discovered, is that, and I'm going to switch back to this, is that masks improve outcomes. There is wonderful evidence that the amount of virus that you initially inhale, you can think about that as your initial viral exposure, whether it's 1 droplet or 100 droplets, right? Like, if you inhale 1 virus, it's not guaranteed that you will become infected. Maybe it never reaches the target cell, right? If you get infected with 1 virus, or infected with 100 viruses, or infected with 1,000 viruses at that initial time point, at that initial exposure, you can think about that as like, how quickly initially will the viruses be able to come online and sort of outstrip or outpace the ability of your immune system to counteract that challenge, right? So think about like that graph again of like how much virus is there and how quickly are you going to sort of start to shoot up that curve. If you started off with 100 times more virus, maybe you actually, accumulate virus and symptoms faster. And it has been shown in the data that even in places with good mask usage, you still see a lot of asymptomatic cases. So the number of cases does drop with mask usage, but it doesn't disappear. But the other thing is you get more asymptomatic individuals or more low symptom individuals, because if you are going to get COVID, inhaling fewer viruses to start gives you less chance of severe illness. And this is something that is one of the sort of bigger issues with things like long-term care, is you might have a lot of individuals who just aren't able to mask for any reason because they don't have the mobility, they don't have the awareness, the sort of, compliance to be able to put on and keep a mask on and sort of understanding what's going on, and not just in, old elderly long-term care, but also where you might have people with neurological disabilities, right? Where they're like not able to just sort of follow those guidelines very well. And if a care worker comes in and happens to be having some COVID leakage through their mask or something like that, if they're giving off COVID to an unmasked individual, you're more likely to see severe outcomes. And once unmasked individuals in long-term care are exhaling viruses unmasked, the concentration of virus in the air really goes up, and the type of severity is probably going to go up as well. So the masking, the sort of, isn't just we're trying to prevent cases, but we're trying to prevent severity of cases. Last question I've got on my list here. This is going to be my last one. Will I just keep going as long as people are asking questions? I'd like to know if there's any data and rates of disability, severity, duration, type, demographics. So are we talking about like long COVID disability, like long-standing effects and things like that. I don't know that there's really great data on what predicting who gets long COVID and has disability afterwards, and just like severity, like it is probably a immune reaction to true infection. So there is some evidence that I've seen, some studies where they've actually found that getting COVID-19, being truly infected, you don't just generate antibodies against the spike protein, but you can generate sort of antibodies against other proteins on the inside of the virus and things like that. And you could generate these like off-target antibodies, and it could be that some of the long COVID damage that's seen, like the chronic fatigue and, people are unable to concentrate, people who have, breathing damage, people who end up being unable to smell for months and months later, like those persist after the virus can be fully cleared. Like we can't detect COVID in you anymore, either in a swab sample, in a saliva sample, even in a like fecal sample. Sometimes we can detect virus being sort of passed that way for a long period of time after. And it seems like in long COVID individuals, it's damage that might be your body fought the virus, it gave you an immune response, and that immune response off target did damage to other things, and there's no good way necessarily predicting why it might be happening in those individuals, because we don't have any existing treatment for long COVID. But we know that like absolutely healthy individuals, there's studies where they're like, we looked at 5 weeks after COVID, how many people still were getting headaches. And even in young, healthy individuals, there were still people that were getting these sort of persistent symptoms that were there after the virus was gone. And then your other question is, in terms of risk assessment, I'm over 40. What's my risk? Risk is death is more clear. So I'm also over 40. I'm 44, and I've got asthma. So I think like, maybe that kind of puts me at a little bit of a higher risk for lungs that can be unhappy at times. Like a lot of people, I have suffered COVID fatigue, where you're like, I just infect me already. Like, I'm tired of this. Maybe I'll just be fine. I should just be fine, right? And then I'm like, Kyle, that's so stupid. Like, the chances of someone in my age group being hospitalized from COVID might only be, like in Saskatchewan, it's looking at 4%, but, that's 40 to 59. So, with my asthma, but my younger age, and, I've got a good BMI, whatever, like, even if it's 1% for hospitalization, it's probably 5% for persistent symptoms. And I'm like, why would I want that? Like, about 7-8 years ago, I had pneumonia and I went septic. So the bacteria in my lungs got into my bloodstream, and I essentially almost died. I went to the hospital. I was in the worst pain of my life. Like, just, it was like this crushing and ripping pain at the same time. And like, they were like, yeah, you've got pneumonia. We're going to give you these antibiotics. They sent me home. 6 hours later, at like 4 a.m, they called and had my wife wake me up, and they're like, we need to make sure Kyle's still alive, because it turns out he's septic. His blood culture came up positive for bacteria. And they're like, if it's not the right antibiotic, you would be dead by now. But like, it took probably 5 days before I was eating food. I probably lost 15 pounds from that pneumonia and going septic. I was weak and probably had low oxygen saturation and lung damage for months later. Like, why would I want to potentially replicate that with COVID if it is a 5% or 1% chance? Like, just try not to get infected at all, right? Yeah, and I mean, we're so close to what I think should be not the finish line, but the at least we'll go back to the new normal. Like, if the bulk of the population, we're probably going to have over half of Saskatchewan's population vaccinated by the end of summer. We're going to have most of our vulnerable individuals vaccinated by like May, probably. So, weather and better ventilation and people doing things outside, that is going to naturally bring things down. Vaccination is going to naturally bring things down. We are probably going to get back to, double digits of COVID cases, and then maybe potentially even single digits of COVID cases in Saskatchewan by summer. Not just through vaccination, but through vaccination and behaviors and environment. And that's going to get us to full vaccination and herd immunity. So I am quite hopeful that by fall, we'll be able to be like, you know what? If you have symptoms, stay home. If you haven't been vaccinated, you should be vaccinated. But we can maybe start to, not wear masks anymore unless you have symptoms. Maybe we can start to have people in our houses again before that even, or, bring back, sports and rec activities for kids and things like that. But like, we are not there right now. And it is really foolhardy for us to think like we should start to relax things until, I would say April, May. Like, let's take a look at what the numbers are. We can always, when our numbers are good, say we're opening next week, right? We haven't had a COVID case in Saskatchewan in 10 days. Yeah, we're going to relax all the restrictions, but if things come back, we're going to do what, Nova Scotia or Newfoundland does, and we're going to say, okay, we're going to put a lid on this, we're going to find out what's going on, we're going to make sure it's not being community spread, it's not a new variant, and then we'll go back again, right? Like, everyone wears masks for a week. But I think I'm pretty optimistic that the end is in sight for us. And definitely you're wearing your respirator. I bought my respirator last February at the end of the month. I was going on a trip to New Orleans, and I was like, I should get myself a mask before I leave because COVID's starting to come out. So I haven't worn this out yet, but I've moved the gaskets around so the air no longer comes out the front, and that it actually filters both ways. And like, I've thought about it, and right now I've gone from single mask to double mask, but I'm like, the reason I don't wear this outside the house is that vastly my risk of COVID exposure is through my children, who, my 5 kids are going to school, they wear masks to school, but like, I'm not gonna mask from them. If there were symptoms, I would. I mean, I got a cold back in early December, and I wore a mask at home for a week because I didn't want to risk it until I got a negative result. But like, I have this in my pocket, not my pocket, it's huge, but I have this in my, arsenal in case I need to do it. And yeah, definitely, like, if variants are spreading in Saskatoon and I'm like, you know what, I just want to be extra safe when I'm at the grocery store, I might be sort of wearing that bestest mask, and definitely makes a good seal. Meat says, do you think university will still be online in September? It won't be until May that the university makes that decision. I can tell you currently where we're at because I've done like undergraduate chairs meetings and things like that. We are planning for some face-to-face classes in fall, but planning that large face-to-face classes might still be online. So we might put in a limitation and say that, you know what, every class is going to be in a double capacity room. Like, how many times have I taught a class where it's like, there are 50 students in this class and the thing on the door says it holds 52, like, and you're like, yeah, I don't see where you'd fit the other two students in this class, right? That's not going to work very well. But if our numbers are low and we've vaccinated like into teenage years, like we could be able to be there again. But the university isn't going to be able to enforce that people have been vaccinated to go back on campus. So we might do a hybrid model where large classes go online, but maybe they are live where people are watching it, just more dispersed. And smaller classes are done in larger rooms and labs and things like that. And maybe we'll still mask. Like there's a lot of things in play, but I hope that some of our more valuable experiences for the university, where it is those small group discussions, it is those, office hours, those study groups, those labs, that is something that we are definitely missing out on, is that quality of education. And it's important right now that we aren't doing those things to save lives, but it's not quite a replacement to do things online, right? But yeah, that decision won't be made until May. It might be we go back to normal if things really, we could have potentially a fifth vaccine that is out there and everyone's been double dosed with 2 different vaccines and we're like, yeah, we're perfect. Or maybe variants will be spreading and we'll be like, you know what, we need to cut back again. That's why we don't want to, let our guards down, right? If we let variants become the dominant one in Canada, that's what we're going to need to vaccinate against. And it might be that our current vaccines with the right variant would not be particularly effective. That's why we also need to have worldwide vaccination, because even if Canada gets to COVID zero, the last country to get to herd immunity, where it's actively spreading, is going to be generating more variants, and those are going to be selected for as variants that are antibody evading, that they don't work with our current vaccines, right? So like humanity needs to pull together on this, and we need to like say, we're not safe individually until our entire community is safe, or until our entire country, or until the entire world is safe from this. And eventually we'll get there, but we don't need to have this like vaccine nationalism and like we're fine now, we don't need to worry about anyone else. Because if anything has been learned in the last year, it's that viruses spread, and that unless you can adopt a completely exclusionary COVID zero policy like New Zealand or Iceland or wherever they've sort of nailed things down, Singapore, I think they've done really well, it will still spread to you. And New Zealand can't let their guard down for their COVID zero until they have herd immunity and everyone's been vaccinated. And then as well, it might not protect against some variants. I think I'm good. I think I'm done talking. I've been talking for 2 hours and 20 minutes now. It's a long time. It's longer than most lectures that I teach. So I'm going to say goodnight to you all. Those of you who are still here, there's 13 of you. Thanks for listening. Do I count as one of those 13? I don't even know. But, thanks. I'm going to put thanks for learning, because that's what this is all about, right? Just trying to help educate people.